The giant exercise wheel accelerated yet again, while Melinda raced, caged within it. The machine towered 200 meters high, under a fan-vaulted roof. Shafts of light of blood-red and cyanotic blue and bilious green beamed through tracery windows, which themselves revolved kaleidoscopically. Chains of brass amulets dangling from the rotating spokes of the wheel clashed and clanged deafeningly, like berserk bells, as they whirled around. Elsewhere in the gymnasium of the Calidus Shrine, high-kicking initiate assassins broke plasteel bars, or else their own tarsal or heel bones. Injury was no excuse to discontinue the exercise. Now they must master pain instead. Others dislocated their limbs by muscle tension, as to escape from bonds, before crawling through constricted, kinking pipes. A pump sucked blood dazingly from two youths prior to their practicing unarmed combat, and from another before he would attempt to run the gauntlet along a corridor of spinning knives. Calisthenics machines shrieked and roared and spun so as to disorientate their users. Melinda had been running for half an hour, trying to catch a fellow assassin who ran vertically above her, upside down, wearing an experimental gravity reverser belt. She ran in a self-induced trance, imagining that she might presently reach such an enlightened state of mind that she could speed up inhumanly and loop the loop, stunning her quarry as she passed by. Whenever she was about to put on such a spurt, the wheel sped up to frustrate her. Suddenly, with a thunderous crash of engaging sprockets and a screaming of gears, the wheel halted. Melinda was hurled forward violently. Though the event was entirely unexpected, she was already fully alert and arching herself into a hoop as to roll. Uncoiling, she somersaulted backwards. She leapt about face. The wheel was already beginning to turn in the opposite direction and picking up speed. High overhead, her quarry was tumbling. She sprinted up, willing the friction of her bare feet and her sheer renewed momentum to stop her from toppling back down the giant curved track. Presently, a siren wailed, signalling the end of her session, just when she fancied she had a slight chance in succeeding in what was virtually an impossible task. Dismissing any temptation to feel annoyed, she skipped about and ran back down the wheel. A filigree gate opened and she stepped out. "Director Shukundus invites your presence in an hour," the wheelmeister told her. The bald old man, one of whose eyes was a ruby lens, forbore to comment on her performance. As a seasoned graduate of the Collegia Assassinorium, Melinda should be able to assess that for herself. If not, she was less than devout. "Invite?" she queried. The Director Secundus was none other than deputy to the Supreme Director of the Calidus Shrine of Assassins. Did such a high official invite? That was the phrasing. In a domed cubicle in the baptisterium, Melinda peeled off her cling-tight black tunic. As hypersound vibrated sweat and grime loose from her, she gazed at her body in a tall speculum, framed with brass bones interwoven and knotted. She permitted herself a certain degree of admiration over and above mere physical assessment, for she was trained as a pedigree courtesan, as well as a sleek and cunning killer. A courtesan, even one who largely pretended to fulfill the role of a pleasure-bringer, must be conscious of sensuality. Melinda was tall, long-limbed, with puissant biceps and calf muscles, though her sheer height diluted the impression of power. Enticing black tattoos concealed her scars. A giant hirsute spider wrapped around her midriff, A snake baring fangs climbed her right leg. Scarab beetles trod the modest swell of her bosom. Her curly hair was cropped short so that no one could seize it. Her courtesan role she might, or might not, opt to wear in a lustrous wig. Her eyes golden, her ivory face oddly anonymous and unmemorable in repose. But then she could alter her features to those of an enchantress, or equally, those of a hag. The director Secundus did not summon her. He invited her. She probed at the word, just at the tip of one's tongue might tease at a hollow tooth loaded with poison for spitting into a victim's eye to paralyze him. It was unthinkable that the Secundus dreamed of exploiting this wonderful instrument which his collegia had crafted from feral world flesh for any private satisfaction of his own. That would be blasphemous. Had Melindy not a sham courtesan as well as an assassin, this thought would have hardly have occurred at all. Invite. The word hinted at the protocol of the mors voluntaria, permission to commit exemplary suicide, which was granted to an assassin who had failed calamitously, though honourably in some enterprise, or whose suicide might be required, as so to erase the principal witness of an error on the part of the officio assassinorium. Melindy knew that she had in no way failed her vocation. Puzzled, she anointed the soles of her feet with consecrated camphor oil, her loins with oil of frankincense, and the crown of her head with rosemary, then performed a devotion to the emperor before resuming her tunic. At the invitation of Tarik Aziz, the Secundus, Melindy seated herself in the double lotus position, facing him. She bowed her head. The lotus that locked her legs together and the aversion of her gaze were both modes of obeisance towards a superior in his private studium, and thus she signified that she was hampering herself from any assassination bid. True, she could recoil in an instant and launch herself, nor did a skilled assassin need to be staring at her target. The faint sigh of the man's lungs, his odour, the mere pressure in the air, located Ziz for her. But nor would any such traitorous, motiveless attack succeed. Tarik Ziz was reputedly Omega Dan. The black-robed Secundus knelt on a brocaded dais, which was also his Spartan bed, facing an ancient Baroque data console. His long, beringed fingers occasionally tapped a sequence of keys, one side of his mind seemingly involved in other concerns. Tomes bound in skin and data cubes crowded one wall up to the groin-vaulted ceiling. A collection of thousands of tiny, burnished archaic knives, many no larger than fingernails, ornamented another wall, resembling the myriad wings torn from metallic moths, shattering the light from an electro-flambeau into quicksilver fragments. "You may look at me, Melinda." Ziz was swarthy, short and compact, almost a dwarf save for his sinuous fingers. The many rune-wrought rings he wore undoubtedly concealed a pharmacy of exotic hallucinogens and paralytic agents, even though the Secundus no longer operated in the field. His artificial teeth, alternatively of jet and vermilion, were all canines. "You are one of our finest chameleons," Ziz said to her softly. Melindy nodded, for this was the simple truth. An injection of the shape-changing drug polymorphine would allow any trained assassin of her shrine to alter their appearance by effort of will. This was one of the specialities of the Calidus shrine, the keynote of which was cunning, just as the Vindicare shrine specialized in vengeance, and the Eversaw shrine in unstoppable attack. Under the stimulus of polymorphine, flesh would flow like heated plastic, bones would soften, reshape themselves, and harden again, altering her height, her frame, her features. Melindy had frequently masqueraded as other women, gorgeous and ugly, noble and common. She had mimicked men. On one occasion she had imitated a tall, hauntingly beautiful alien of the Eldar race, always with the purpose of eradicating someone whose activities imperiled the Imperium, with the aim of destroying a foe physically, or, more rarely, psychologically. Yet the drug polymorphine on its own was no miracle elixir. The business of shape-shifting demanded a deep sympathy with the person who was to be copied, killed, and replaced. The trick required empathy, deep identification with the target, and inner discipline. Inject a non-initiate with polymorphine, and the result would be a protoplasmic chaos of the body, an agonizing anarchy of the flesh and bones and organs, an ongoing muddled upheaval and meltdown, resulting finally in blessed death. Melindy was an excellent disciplined chameleon, exactly as the Secundus said. Though she was no psyker, yet inscribed in the cells of her flesh and the chambers of her brain was assuredly a wild gene rune for aping the appearance and traits of strangers, for metamorphosizing herself, which the drug allowed her to express to the utmost. If she had been born on a cultured world, she might have become an actress. On her own feral homeworld, she might have become a priestess of some cult of mutability. Recruited willy-nilly when a child from her barbarian tribe, she could now, as a Calidus assassin, become virtually any stranger, which was a fine fulfillment for her. Ziz leaned forward. Because of your talent, our shrine invites you to participate in a experimental procedure. I am but an instrument, she replied, in the service of our shrine. Her answer was obedient and dutiful, with the merest hint of caution, as one might expect from a Calidus initiate. You are a thinking instrument, my daughter, a wise one whose mind must be in perfect tune with the changes you will undergo, or else the result could prove fatal. What changes, Secundus? When Ziz told her, Melinda gasped once, as if her dwarfish Omegadan superior had punched her in her muscle-stiffened stomach. When she left his studium, she trotted through the labyrinth of shadowy corridors where any but an initiate would soon be hopelessly lost. Reaching the gymnasium, she begged the wheelmeister to evict a novice from the apparatus and readmit her. Scrutinizing her, the bald old man appeared to appreciate her need. Soon Melindy was running as if to race right away from the shrine, away to the very stars, to anywhere else where she may be able to lose herself entirely and never be found again. As if the worst nightmares were pursuing her, she sprinted. Thus she vented her feelings of appalled anguish without absconding disobediently to anywhere else wherever. Finally, hours later, so it seemed, at the point of exhaustion such as Melindy had never verged on before, she achieved a kind of acceptance of her fate. Just as the exercise wheel had changed direction of a sudden previously, so had the wheel of her own fortune reversed shockingly. Out of binding allegiance to her shrine, on account of the solemn and sinister oaths she had sworn, because the Collegia Assassinorum had made her everything she was, she must comply. She was invited to do so. Refusal was unthinkable. The only alternative was exemplary suicide, to volunteer for a mission that was guaranteed to destroy her, after destroying many foes. Melindy was Calidus, not ever so. Till now she had never felt suicidal. Till now. Nor after her passion-purging run in the wheel did that alternative tempt her. Even if her shrine in the refusable person of Tarek Ziz seemed bent on amputating her talent, aye, mutilating it, by way of experiments. As the laser scalpels hovered over her naked, paralyzed body, Melindy gazed askew at the senior Shuriken, whose robe was embroidered with purity symbols and prophylactic hexes. She could move her eyeballs fractionally. Her field of view additionally took in the robed, tattooed radiographer adept, mounted and wired into the brace-mounted examinator. This towered alongside the operating table like a predatory armadillo, scanning the inner strata of her body with multiple snouts. Its eye lens projected 4 infant-sized holograms of herself into midair, side by side. One hologram was of her body flayed so that all of her muscle was exposed. Another revealed only the rivers, tributaries, and streams of her circulatory system. A third dissected out her nerve network. A fourth stripped her skeleton bare. These homunculi of herself rotated slowly, as if afloat in invisible bottles, displaying themselves to her and to the Shuriken. The lanky adept who monitored the drips of macchiato that numbed and froze her sat in a framework resembling a giant spider. Its antennae reached out to sting her insensible, although not unconscious, for her mind must understand the procedure she was about to undergo. An elderly, warty, gnome-like medicus knelt on a rubber cushion to whisper in her ear. Melindy could hear him, but not see him, nor see the other adepts in the surgical laboratory who superintended the body implants and extra glands awaiting in stasis tureens. Melindy felt nothing, not the clamp that held her mouth, nor the silver nozzle that gargled saliva from it, not the grooved operating table underneath her, with its runnels for any spilled blood or other fluids. Unable to shift her head, yet capable of rolling her eyeballs a fraction, she merely saw somewhat, and heard the murmurings of the warty gnome. "First we transact your shoulders and your arms. Later we will of course be heedful of the topography of your tattoos." She heard a laser scalpel descending, buzzing like a busy fly. The process was beginning. An assassin could block off agony, could largely disconnect her consciousness from the screaming switchboard of pain in her brain. Thus was an assassin trained, thus was the web of her brain restrung. How otherwise could she fulfill her missions if injured? How else could she focus her empathy without distraction during the polymorphine change? However, during a total dissection such as this, some muscles might well spasm instinctively, thwarting the Shuriken's delicate maneuvers. Consequently, she was anesthetized awake. The gnome's words registered, yet in her heart, in her wounded heart, Melindy was still hearing Tarek Ziz announce how she would be desecrated. Initiates of Kaladas can imitate all sorts and conditions of people. Who can do so better than you, Melindy? You have even mimicked a humanoid elder sufficiently well to convince human beings. And well enough to persuade another elder for a while, Secundus, she reminded him discreetly. Ziz nodded. Yet we cannot adopt the form of other alien creatures whom we might wish to copy. We are constrained by our limbs, by our bones, by the flesh that is available. What do you know about gene stealers, Melindy? At that point, Melindy had experienced a chilling, weakening, cavernous pang, as though her entrails had emptied out of her. It took a moment to identify the unfamiliar sensation. It was terror, terror such as she believed had been expunged from her long since, torn out of her by the root during training. "What do you know?" he repeated. Genestealers have 4 arms, she recited robotically. 2 arms equipped with hands, and 2 with claws that can tear through plasteel armor as if it is tissue. Their heads are long and bulbous, fanged. Their horny spine bends them into a permanent crouch. They have an armored carapace and a powerful tail. Yet it was not the creatures themselves that appalled her. No. It was the implication behind Ziz's question. Polymorphine could never turn us into one of those, Secundus. Not polymorphine alone, Melindy. As the medicus murmured his commentary, interspersed with pious invocations to the Emperor, echoing those of the preceding Shurigan, she squinted askew at the homunculi of herself being dissected open, and knew that the very same was happening to herself. Tiny stasis generators were clipped away inside her to stop her blood from spurting and draining away. She was a snared hare stretched out on the butcher's block. "We shall use body implants," Ziz had continued. "We will insert extrudable plastiflesh, reinforced with carbon fibers, into your anatomy. We will introduce flexicartilage, which can toughen hard as horn. In repose, in their collapsed state, these implants will lurk within your body imperceptibly. Yet they will remember their shape and strength, programmed into their fabric. When triggered, while polymorphine softens your flesh and bone, those implants will swell into full active mode." The mosaic of tiny glittering knives on the wall seemed to take wing, to leap at Melindy, to flay her. "We will graft extra glands into you to store and synthesize with speed growth hormone, somatotrophin, and glands to reverse the process." "But," she had murmured despairingly, "I could still not become a perfect genestealer, could I?" "At this stage, that is not necessary. You will be able to transform into a convincing genestealer hybrid form. A hybrid with only 1 pair of arms and lacking a tail. One closer to the semblance of humanity, yet sufficiently polluted, sufficiently grotesque to persuade those with whom you must infiltrate. If this experiment succeeds, we hope subsequently we shall attempt to implant secondary limbs." "Into me?" Did her voice quiver? Ziz shook his head. "Into another volunteer. You will be committed to the hybrid form, only able to alternate between that and your own human anatomy." Melindy's horror grew. What Ziz proposed couldn't simply be a gratuitous experiment, could it? One conducted merely out of curiosity. Melindy licked her lips. "I take it, Secundus, that there is some specific mission in view." Ziz smiled thinly and told her. To Melindy, the mission almost seemed to be a pretext, a trial to test whether she could perform to specification and survive. And yet, of course, she was no arbiter of the importance of a mission. The art of the assassin was to apply lethal pressure at one crucial, vulnerable spot in society, a point which might not always seem central, yet which her superiors calculated was so. Often a target was prominent, a corrupt planetary governor, a disloyal high official. Yet dislodging a seemingly humble pebble could, in some circumstances, start an avalanche. A Calidus assassin wasn't a slaughterer, but a cunning surgeon. Surgery. "You are one of our most flexible chameleons, Melindy. Surely our experiment will succeed best with you. This could lead to wondrous things, the imitating of slans, of tyranids. How else could we ever infiltrate such alien species if the need arose?" "You honor your servant," she mumbled. "You say that I will be committed." "Hereafter, when using polymorphine, you will unfortunately only be able to adopt the genestealer hybrid form, none other." It was, as she deeply feared. She would lose all other options of metamorphosis. She would be flayed of her proud talent, of what, in her heart, made her Melindy. It was so strange that an outstanding ability to mimic other people could reinforce a sense of self. Not so odd, for Melindy had been snatched away as a child from home and tribe, from language and customs. After initial stubbornness, insisting on her own sovereign identity, she had yielded, and therefore had found her own firm foundation in flexibility. "I'm also trained as a courtesan, Secundus," she reminded Ziz humbly. A momentarily bitter grimace twisted the lips of the swarthy, stunted Omegadan. "You are splendid enough to be one exactly as you are. We must be willing to prune our ambitions according to the needs of the shrine and of the Imperium. Ambition is vanity in this world of death." Had Ziz sacrificed his own ambitions in the process of rising to the rank of Director Secundus? Ziz was in line to become Supreme Director of the Calidus Shrine, and thus perhaps Grand Master of the Assassins, a High Lord of Terror. This experiment, if successful, might play a significant role in his personal advancement. "I am but an instrument," Melindy echoed, hollowly. And that is why she had fled to the exercise wheel, to run until she felt utterly empty enough to accept. The surgical procedure had already lasted for 3 painstaking, pious hours. The whispery voice of the watery gnome was growing hoarse. A subskin of compacted, reinforced, clever plastiflesh was now layered within Melindy's arms, legs, and torso. The pseudo-flesh was clever in 2 regards. It was sending invasive neural fibers deep into her anatomy, fusing physiology. In this, it was cousin to the black carapace which was grafted to every space marine as the crowning act of his transformation into superhuman. Furthermore, the false flesh could remember the contours it was programmed to assume and would forever override any rebellious impulse of Melindy to counterfeit a different form. It was like a map embroidered onto supple fabric, which, upon stimulus, would expand, springing into shape stiffly, extruding from its contour lines in the mountains of monstrosity. The anatomical experimentum adepts of Calidus had been ingenious. Likewise, blades of flexicartilage were inserted beneath her finger and toenails, sheathed her phalanges, her metatarsal and metacarpal bones. Stubs of the same had been grafted to her vertebrae, to her splint bones and femurs, and elsewhere. Oh, she had been thoroughly, devoutly operated on, and now the climax was coming. As the laser scalpel swung down towards her staring face, instruments came into play around her eyes, her nose, her clamped open mouth, her cranium. The medicus murmured huskily, "By submucous resection, we now incise inside the nostrils to elevate the lining membrane from the septum and insert spurs of flexicartilage, thus to develop the gene-stealer's snout." And this was happening to her. "We drill all the frontal teeth to replace the roots with fungplasm." And this was happening to her too. "We sever the frenum fold under the tongue for greater flexibility of that organ. We perform a partial glossectomy, akin to the coring of your tongue, were it a rose-red apple, to insert a similitude of gene-stealer tongue." And this was also happening to her, as she squinted askance at the spinning stems of silver precision tools, whilst the gurgling pipe sucked away minced and vaporized flesh. Presently, "We lift your scalp so to trepan the skull. We perform a frontal cranotomy, so that islets of skull will spread more easily to assume the gene-stealer profile." Aye, that profile, and none other. No eerily elegant alien silhouette, no glory girl, no hags, no one else's, other than that single bestial shape, and this was happening to her. As laser scalpels sliced her face and skull, she screamed within. Boiling outrage welled in her heart. Grievance, gall, and bitterness mixed their corrosive acid cocktail in her belly. Her spirit shrieked. Yet necessarily, she lay silent as stone. She lay silent as a marble woman whose ruthless sculptors were carving her into an evil idol. Aye, silent as the very void that now opened her tormented soul, swallowing her scream, sucking it away as surely as the silver tube sucked away parts of herself. And in that terrible silence, part of Melindy still listened. Alone. Alone, and more than ever alone. And now evermore alone. Melindy walked towards a huge eroded sandstone temple under a coppery sky, inflamed by a giant red sun. The awesome sun filled a quarter of the heavens. Nevertheless, the air was chilly, for such suns yielded only meagre heat. The temple complex dominated the end of a dusty boulevard lined by arcaded buildings of glazed terracotta, with interior courtyards sheltered by domes. The arcades were crowded with vendors of barbecued bird legs, stuffed mice, and hot-spiced wine, of holograms of this holy city of Shandabar, of supposed fragments of relics embedded in crystal, and models of such relics. Those loggia were thronged with beggars and cripples and conjurers, with fortune-tellers, robed pilgrims, and gaudy tourists. Temple concessionaires, some of them retired priests, were selling icons guaranteed as imperially blessed, and to those who underwent the trivial test of sticking their hand inside a humming hexbox, lurid silken purity tassels, so called. These promised protection from evil in proportion to the size and number and fluidity of tassels produced and purchased. The Orand Temple of Shandabar, built at what had once been the Eastern Gateway, was in fact the least of the Holy City's three major temples. However, it boasted a giant guarded jar of long, curving, talon-like fingernails. These were undoubtedly clippings from the Emperor's own hands, dating from the mythic days before he had been encased in his golden throne. Due to his immortal power and reach throughout the galaxy, those disembodied nails were to continue growing slowly, as if still connected to his person. The priests could trim and shave off authentic pairings for sale to the faithful, those who might wear them, or grind them to dust as so to drink in potions. The temple also housed, in a huge silver reliquary, the thigh bones of a marine commander from long ago, and in a baroque copper cage, what was reputed to be the partial skeleton of a demon. Carts drawn by camelopards with humps suggestive of huge inflamed boils, snaking necks, and lugubrious, whiskery, stupid faces creaked to and fro along the boulevard, carrying sightseers and vegetables. Balloon-tired cars and the occasional armoured police or security vehicle growled by. Even the Orient Temple was notably wealthy. Melindy wore the capacious brown robe of a pilgrim, with a cowl that hid her features in shadow. Cinching her waist was her scarlet assassin's sash, which concealed garrotes, blades, vials of chemicals, and a digital needle gun. Within her robe were the other articles of her primary trade. And what was hidden within her? Why, the most evil shape, a vile shape that forever constrained her now, that denied her the option of masquerading as anyone she pleased. That shape, which, inscribed within her healed anatomy, physically implanted in collapsed form, denied her access to any of the sham physiques that she had thought herself as, well, sisters, mothers, cousins to herself. And thus she was utterly alone. Her only doppelganger was a monster, the alien beast within. Melindy grieved as she entered a caravanserai near the temple. Camelopards were tethered to steel rings set in the flagstones of the vast courtyard. Ropes hobbled their lanky legs fore and aft, lest they lash out. Flies buzzed around their large orange droppings. Tents were pitched under the dome. Galleries, reached by curving iron stairways, housed 3 upper tiers of semi-private rooms with linked balconies. Smoke from several bonfires of dried dung drifted out through the open eye at the zenith of the dome. These fires notwithstanding, the chill of the night would creep in from outside. the more traditional breed of traveller who shunned the shivers of the early hours and who sought privacy would rent a tent. Poorer cousins would wrap themselves in bedrolls on the hard flags. The hunchbacked, sallow-complexed proprietor asked in the common language of Shalob, "Seeking lodgings?" Any assassin was already fluent in major dialects of Imperial Gothic, as well as a number of human language which had drifted far enough from their origins as to bear no resemblance to its roots. An assassin constantly added new languages to her repertoire. Melindy had done likewise, using a hypnocask, a knowledge inducer on the cargo ship en route to the Sandy World. The electronic tattoo on her palm currently declared her to be the daughter of a planetary governor, intent on a pilgrimage. "Preferring lowest room," she replied. "Being from Caravan World, surface uninhabitable. Suffering from vertigo and sky fear." She pulled the capacious hood even further forward, implying that this headgear was her private cave. She paid the proprietor a week in advance in shekels, exchanged at the spaceport against Imperial credit programmed into her tattoo, and added a shekel as a modest sweetener. "Being cellar rooms under your caravanserai?" she asked. A reasonable question, given her explanation. She allowed a hint of vulnerability and pleading to colour her voice, though a harder overtone of someone accustomed to be indulged and obeyed warned that she was not to be taken advantage of. "Being indeed, though not habitable." The hunchback's palm seemed to itch. "Being even an old tunnel, perhaps, if this guest is preferring to visit Orion's by risking sticky cobwebs, but avoiding open sky." "Oh no," she demurred. "Being pilgrim, same as others, but thanking you for offering favour." She slipped him an extra half-shekel. Next morning, Melindy took the full-scale guided tour of the Orion's temple, alert for signs of covert gene-stealer infestation, such as four-armed idols, however small, tucked away in however inconspicuous a niche. A scrawny, long-nosed priest guided her party. In the hall of only fingernails, robed guardian deacons sat hunched on tripod stools around a tall crystal jar of parings, nursing what appeared to be some sort of stun gun of local manufacture. While the guide enthused about the miracle of how the Emperor's nails continued to grow, Melindy pretended that she was about to make an offering. She contrived to spill some half-shekels far and wide from her purse. Recovering her coins, she stooped to squint inside the hoods of the guards. Two of those deacons certainly possessed the sharper teeth and glaring eyes of hybrids who could hope to pass for human, at least in shadow. Massive candles burned, rendering the rune mosaics of the walls waxy as the inside of a beehive. Bowls of smouldering incense flavoured the honey of the air. She thought of cellars under the caravanserai and of the tunnel. Under this elderly temple there must be crypts and catacombs and tunnels extending who knows how far beneath the ancient city. "Now conducting you to the Hall of Femurs," announced the guide. Her journey through the warp to Salob had been brief enough, but some years of local time would have passed since whichever spy of the Imperium had left to report his or her suspicions. The infestation by gene-stealers had plainly been underway for a number of generations. Gene-stealers would hide. They would hide, seeking to maintain a facade of normality for as long as possible. Ultimately, the evil brood would hope to control the city through their more presentable offspring and even the planet, while still maintaining the pretense that life was normal. Long before that stage was reached, the Imperium ought to take utmost measures. Meanwhile, Tarek Ziz judged cunningly, or rashly, that there existed leeway for an experiment. Had he consulted with the Supreme Director? Had the Supreme Director consulted with the Grand Master? And had the Grand Master consulted with, who? The Lord Commander Militant? An instrument of Calidus should not dream of asking such questions. Nor did Melindy understand the Imperium in its complex entirety. She was but an instrument. Yet she was aware that the rapid and total destruction of gene-stealers, wherever found, was military priority. "Please coming this way, pious pilgrims." In a crypt beneath the temple, the Genestealer Patriarch, the first of the evil aliens to pollute a victim, would roost on its throne, attended by its offspring in hybrid or quasi-human form. By the fourth generation, they would each be able to sire or bear new, pure-strain stealers. Had that stage been reached, the nominal leader of the brood, the charismatic human-seeming Magus, would undoubtedly have been the high priest of the Orient's temple, which would seem to continue the worship of the Emperor of all mankind. Humans who had been polluted by stealers were mesmerized. Their human-seeming offspring needed a brood bond so that they loved their bestial cousins and uncles intensely. Would Melindy, in her altered body, possess enough chameleon empathy to fool that brood bond? She almost ignored the sacred pitted thigh bones of the marine poised in their reliquary. In that moment, beneath her feet, perhaps lurked the fierce, bloated, armoured, cloven-footed Patriarch. Just as inside her there lurked an example of its bastard progeny, as if it had kissed her deep with its seed-planting tongue. Then presently she saw that the partial skeleton of the supposed demon in that copper cage, filigrated with hexes and a crackle with blue sparks, energized that no demonic claimant could return. She wondered if those hunched alien bones were actually those of a pure-stained stealer, set up sardonically in the place of honor by the Patriarch, while the real relic languished somewhere else. The tour lasted for another 2 hours, comprising lavishly decaying halls, sacriums, and lesser shrines. She saw some evidence of ongoing embellishment and repair, yet evidently wealth was not being squandered on the imperial cult. The donated shekels and those gleaned from the sales of relics would be sustaining an ever-extending family of inhumans underground. When Melindy and her party were at last returned to the great courtyard, a liturgical pageant was about to begin. "Seeing a blessed emperor defeating a demon, you are witnessing within," cried a herald. Demons and aliens were creatures of very different stripe, and Genestealers certainly fell into the latter category of natural beings. The less known about the demons of chaos, the better. Ironically, the herald, knowing no better, blurred out something forbidden, as though to advertise whatever flummery would be staged. "A shekel apiece, good pilgrims, so that we may be proceeding." A scruffulous dwarf scurried to and fro, collecting coins until he was satisfied with the height of the pile. The illusion of a huge and ornate throne room sprang up all around, cast by hidden holographic projectors. The sandy ground of the courtyard now seemed to be a tessellated marble. A horde of gorgeous abject lords and ladies grovelled before a leering, green-hued, sag-bellied monster sprawling in great spike-backed throne. Mutant guards, wearing obscene and blasphemous power armor, kept vigil, cradling bolt pistols and axes. The demon glowed luridly. Jagged threads of lightning flickered between its froggy hands. Melindy was wryly amused. At that moment, a parody of space marines with brutish bulbous heads burst into the throne room. They fired explosive bolts at the guards, who fired back in turn. Caught up in the illusion, the audience of pilgrims screamed. Rapidly, as if matter met antimatter, all the guards and all of the mock marines died and vanished. So did the lords and ladies, leaving the stage clear. A tall, aura-cloaked figure entered, wearing a flashing golden crown. A mask of wires and tubes hid the Emperor's face. From his outstretched hand sprouted nails which were as long again as his fingers. He gestured challengingly at the demon, or alien lord, as Melindy stared, transfixed. Those nails swelled into claws, and an extra set of hands and arms plainly burst forth from the sides of the Emperor's ribcage. Plainly, this pageant was designed to confuse the beliefs of the onlookers, already confused, so that they would identify the Holy Emperor with the image of the Genestealer, who would soon tear the fat green demon alien apart and claim that throne. "Fool," cried a voice, "this being the climax, not the prelude." Behind the goggling, gasping pilgrims, a tall, purple-cloaked man was rebuking the herald, whom he was hauling along by the scruff of his neck. Like a ventilator cowl or radar dish, the newcomer's high, stiffened hood cupped a long, menacing, yet enchanting face. His cranium was shaved bald. Knobbly bumps above his brows were tattooed with butterflies unfurling their wings, as if beauteous thoughts were bursting forth from there. It was indeed a magus. Melindy slipped closer to him. "Not noticing our error, exalted one," babbled the herald, "being outside of the holorama, apologizing, soon rectifying, recommencing the performance." As Melindy concentrated all of her attention on the magus, the man seemed to sense her scrutiny and gazed towards her piercingly. His nostrils flared like a horse scenting fire on the wind. His gaze was compelling, but did not compel her. Shucking her hood further forward, the more to gloom her shadowed face, she withdrew and walked towards the illusionary walls of the throne room. She strolled away across the gritty courtyard back towards the boulevard and caravanserai. The bloated sun of the dull blood was sinking. Let her not be distracted by grief at what she must do now. Let her not betray her shrine, even if her shrine had, in a sense, betrayed her. She was an instrument, and now the shape of the tool must change. That evening, Melindy crept through a twisting, turning, cobwebbed tunnel, exerting her chameleon instinct. Best that she should be quite close to those she copied. The metamorphosis would proceed more speedily, and she by no means wished to linger over it. The electrolumin in her hand feebly lit ancient rune-carved stones matted with dusty spider silk, in which the bones of little lizards hung. Presently she reached an appendix to a deserted crypt, in which solitary nubs of candles burnt low. Ahead were branching catacombs lit by the occasional oil lamp, leading towards a brighter glow than the moan of a distant choir. Her robe was loose, and would accommodate her changes, but she dropped it nonetheless. She did not wish to disguise her new form. She injected polymorphine, swiftly hid the tiny empty syringe in a crevice where no one should ever find it. She had left her assassin's sash in the caravanserai. With her hands transformed into claws, she could hardly have manipulated the garrots or knives, let alone a miniature Jocaro gun that was meant to slip onto a fingertip. She had hoped the device she had rigged in her room to re-inject her and restore her would penetrate her toughened body. Maybe she would be obliged to inject through her eye. A wave of agony coursed through her, and she blocked it. She hunched over. Her body was molten. As she focused her attention, the implants began to express themselves. Bumps thrust up along her bending spine. Her jaw tore open, elongating into a toothy snout. Her eyes bulged, her arms swelled, and the phalanges of her fingers became long, thick claws. Now her hips distorted. Now her very skin was hardening into a tough carapace, which she knew would be a livid blue. Fairly soon she was an extreme specimen of gene-stealer hybrid, whom no one could surely suspect to be anything else under the skin, underneath the carapace. She exerted all of her empathy as she loped onward through the catacomb and into a great subterranean chamber, pillared and vaulted, awash with torchlight, alive with broodkin, many of whom were brutish, others of whom might pass muster as human. The hiss of many throats silenced the inhuman choir that was serenading, or communicating with, the Patriarch on its horned throne. Human-seeming guards directed weapons at her. Broodkin rushed towards her, snarling. Oh, the hunchbacked steward of the caravanserai must have dreamed of a pretty prank to play on this high-born pilgrim daughter from another world. He must have been well aware of what he would guide her into. Hybrids, more human than herself, formed a menacing circle around Melindy. On his throne, nostril flaring, the Patriarch bared his fangs. Through the midst of this deadly cordon strode the magus, cloak swirling. "Ow!" Melindy hissed.
"Seeking sanctuary with my kind."
Issuing from a distorted larynx over a twisted tongue, her voice was far from human. Yet the Magus must well be accustomed to such voices. "Where coming from?" he demanded, fixing Melindy with his mesmeric gaze.
"Hiding on starship," she replied. "Imperials destroying my brood, all of my clan but me, craving sanctuary."
"How finding us here?"
"Wrapping myself in robe, skulking by night, checking temples being where may be finding my distant kin."
The Magus scrutinized Melindy searchingly. "You being first-generation hybrid, excellent body, mostly." He locked his gaze with hers, and she felt swayed, but was trained to resist ordinary mesmeric enchantments. The Magus chuckled. "Of course we are not compelling one another. We are only compelling the human cattle, our own bond being one of mutual devotion, of heeding the calls which you cannot heed, not being of our brood." He turned, "As I am now heeding our master. Be coming with me." The Patriarch was gesturing with a claw. "Escort her carefully, brothers and sisters," the Magus told the guards with a radiant yet twisted smile. And so Melindy approached the monster on the throne, a leering, fang-toothed, armoured hog of a grandsire alien. Its eyes glared from her from under ridged bony brows. One of its lower humanoid hands, adorned with topaz and sapphire rings, stroked a fierce claw hand that rested on its knee. One of its hooves tapped the floor. Loaves of armoured bone jutted from its curved spine, and it rubbed these against the carved back of its throne grindingly, as if to dispel an itch. Its spatulate tongue stuck out, tasting. Melindy bowed lower than her stoop dictated, thrusting from her mind any hint of assassin thoughts, soaking up and re-radiating as best she could the ambience of grotesque, evil worship.
"Craving sanctuary, greatest father,"
she hissed. This was the crucial moment. The Patriarch's nostril flared, sniffing the faintly oily odours of her spurious body. Its violet vein-webbed eyes, at once odious and alluring, scrutinized her intently. Its gaze caressed and pried intimately at some dulcet scalpel blade smeared with intoxicating aphrodisiac mucus. The granddaddy of evil clicked its claws together contemptuously. One of its hooves drummed the flagstone which was worn at that spot into a rut. No, not evil. This was no way to be thinking of this fine Patriarch. Empathy was the key to impersonation, identification. How Melindy yearned to flee from this den of monsters and demi-monsters, though of course it was far too late to flee. Flee? Well, the very monstrosity resided within herself. In such circumstances, fleeing made no sense, however. She was monstrous too, so therefore she must perceive the Patriarch as the incarnation of benevolence, fatherness, wisdom, maturity. The armoured monster that confronted her personified love, a profound depth of love, love which quite transcended the passions and affections of mundane men and women, whatever such sentiments might feel like to the possessors. Melindy had certainly mimed such emotions in the past. With an assassin's eye she had studied the victims of amorousness, lust, infatuation, and fondness, even if she herself had not been vulnerable. This Gensealer Patriarch radiated such a powerful, protective, brooding love of its true kin and of itself, of the monster, that it could not help but be the perfect, passionately dedicated, self-sanctified monstrosity. Love, fierce, loyal, twisted love, utterly biological. And in a dream that possessed it, almost like some demon, an inner vision of its mission. Human beings seemed to manage the feat almost incidentally and accidentally, albeit the result was 1,000 times 1,000 worlds, many pulsing to the point of bursting with the festering pus of human species, and yet the gene-stealers were compelled to try harder. They couldn't simply writhe in copulation with their own species and produce a litter of brats. Gene-stealers would willingly, nay compulsively infiltrate any species, human, orc, it didn't matter which, Eldar, Slan, Abhuman, to bring about incidentally the corruption and downfall of those species. In a sense, the gene-stealer almost represented cosmic love that knew no boundary of species, that heeded no distinction between male and female, between human and abhuman, human and alien. This patriarch was love incarnate, hideous, enslaving love. Its mission also demanded hair-trigger homicidal fury in defense of its own destiny, and at the same time cunning restraint, intelligence. Its intelligence knew naught of machines, of starships, of bolt pistols, of dynamos or windmills. Tools? Broodkin can use those things, yet it mind-keened much of glands and feelings, of hormonal motifs, of genetic and hypnotic dictates. The patriarch's violet magnetic eyes, set in that hideous magenta countenance, considered Melindy in her hybrid guise, seeing true kindred, or seeing through her, about to turn down its claw. Loving you, she thought, revering you, admiring you. In the same fashion as she revered Calidus, as she honoured her Omegadan director. No, not that one, not Tarek Ziz. In the same way that she revered the Emperor on earth. This clever, loving patriarch was her emperor here, her great father of all. Did it possess a name? Did any gene-stealer? The patriarch grunted wordlessly. Beside her, the Magus rocked to and fro, heeding the alien monster's mental sendings. A hybrid from another star system need not be similarly attuned to those. Granting refuge, murmured the Magus, at last. Embracing you in our tabernacle and in our crusade. The patriarch closed its eyes as if to dismiss Melindy. It folded its humanoid hands across its jutting carapace-banded belly and seemed to drift into a reverie. Its claws twitched rhythmically. Perhaps it was numbering its children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, of whom Melindy, of course, was not one, so though it accepted her into the fold, or at least into the fringe of the fold, she was hardly a total communicant, as all others in this subterranean stronghold were. And how many there were! Brutishly deformed broodkin rubbed shoulders and preened and sang praise. They hissed intimacies with one another. They went about their cult duties. They kept watch and ward. They nurtured the juveniles of the clan, some of whom were marked with the taint, others of whom almost appeared to be sweet, comely children, save perhaps for bumpy brows and the eerie light in their eyes. As Melindy gazed into a nursery area, she wondered how many of the deadly infected children she might need to kill before she could leave this place. If the patriarch, in the wisdom of its alien glands, had chosen to tolerate her presence, the quasi-human Magus retained an edge of skepticism. "Most welcome refugee from far planet," he said. "How being speaking sublorish so readily?" He stroked one of the butterflies, of saffron and turquoise hue, upon his knobbly forehead as if deep in thought. "After hiding on ship, after skulking in city, what opportunity of learning? Seeming remarkable to me, knowing the plurality of languages in the galaxy, many worlds, many lingos and dialects, The Magus was sufficiently persuaded by her body. That passed muster. How could he disbelieve the evidence of the hybrid body that he saw before him? He could not, yet he had come up with a question that she had hardly expected from a fanatical posing as a high priest of some dodgy providential cult devoted to miraculous imperial fingernails. His question was cool and logical. Ought she have to have burst in upon the Gene-Stealer clan, unable to express herself at all, incoherent, babbling in some off-world tongue without explanation? In that event, she might now be caged behind bars strong enough even to hold Gene-Stealer, whilst her hosts investigated her at their leisure. Melindy's mind raced. She was Calidus, wasn't she?
My human mother being Piscaton, Melindy hissed. You hearing of planet Piscatus, Interlingum mimes?
No such planet as Pisticus, the parrot world, existed. Yet in a imperium of 1,000,000 worlds, no one individual, however well-informed, could ever know more than a tiny fraction. Better by far to name a world which didn't exist, rather than one that did, concerning that she might conceivably be faulted. Ah, said the Magus, you enriching my knowledge, being a fertile world for our kind, Pisticus.
Initially, then the killers coming, and the cursed name of their emperor, the ruthless marines, blasting my family, mercifully.
Condolences. Have you been seeing inside our temple up above?
Only from a distance,
lied Melindy. We are using theatrical skills to ensorcel the superstitious pilgrims. We are confusing the image of their god-emperor with that of old forearms. The Magus nodded towards the throne, his tone humorously affectionate in that moment. Oh, how the Magus basked in the embracing patriarchal love of the foulest breed, how he relished the monster's wisdom. What a twisted parody of fondness the man exhibited, a fondness that did not exactly make him a fool, however. The patriarch had nodded off, its claws and fingers spasmed fitfully as bathing in adoration. It dreamt of what? Of mating with human beings, gulled here and dragged here by its broodkin? Of the glory and ecstasy of disseminating its genes, carving its own image into the tormented flesh of the galaxy. After all, we are expanding here enough and consolidating our hold, the Magnus declared. We shall be smuggling missionaries out to other worlds, to stage religious pageants, to spread the cult of the true four-armed ruler of existence. We will be subverting other temples, other pilgrims, other worshippers of that moribund god of earth, of that brittle stick, of that ragdoll locked up in his golden commode. His eyes glowed. How vivid, how alive a four-armed being, how truly superhuman. What other species truly uniting of all the strife-torn stars? What other breed of being physically making men and aliens into cousins, and nurturing and preserving the myriad worlds for its breeding ground forevermore, nor ever casting aside the heritage of men or aliens? Oh, those being like nourishing milk to the four-armed ones.
You being wise,
hissed Melindy. Oh, yes. Myself studying reports and rumours of other worlds that we might be making our own. But, dear refugee, you are tired and famished. Was I speaking of mere milk? You be coming this way. Melindy was indeed ravenous. Soon she was feasting on imported grok steaks and off-world truffles and sweetmeats, bought with donated shekels. She and the brood tore into dainties with their fangs. She fed, but took no gourmet satisfaction in the costly foods. What of the hunchbacked proprietor of the caravanserai? He had to be in league with the Steeler clan, or at the very least he had to be aware of their existence in relatively friendly fashion. Would he otherwise have mischievously told the lone lady traveller of the tunnel? If Melindy remained long amongst the broodkin and the hunchback noted her absence, and then decided to pry into her room and into her belongings, might he report his puzzlement to the temple guards? If Melindy died here, would she care? If she was torn apart by the enraged kin of that vile form which possessed her, would that matter? Would the Jade Stealers, in the act of destroying their own semblance, symbolically annul what desecrated her, as no other death could, thus bringing her a moment's blessed balm before the long dreamless sleep of nullity? Yes, by Calidus it mattered, and by him on earth it mattered. And yet had Calidus not betrayed her? How long dared she remain here? Alternatively, did she dare to try leave? Brooding, Melindy picked her fangs clean with a claw. She lay that night in the torch-lit vault among monsters and demi-monsters, herself a monster. She woke early. She woke into a nightmare and almost cried out in horror. A convulsive spasm racked her. She flinched from herself, for she was the nightmare, her herself, none other. Oh, there were times in the past when he had woken in metamorphosized bodies, in comely bodies, in ugly bodies, even an alien Eldar body, ethereal, beautiful. That one had been radiantly lovely. But she had never woken as a monster. An assassin was trained to respond instantly, to come wide awake at once and attack instantly if need be. Yet in that brief instant of awakening, Melindy was almost impelled by the nightmare of reality to attack her own altered person. She rolled over, rose to a crouch and stretched casually, attempting now in alien body language, should any eyes be scrutinized her, to express relief at finding herself among her monster kin. A spasm had merely been the instinctive reflex of the fugitive, the former supposed stowaway amongst hostile human beings, had it not? A snouty hybrid guard had indeed been eyeing her, she noted. A couple of young whelps of the brood as well. Another hybrid raised its head, daring a look in her direction. Here was family, hypersensitive to an occult sticky web of relationships, hormonal bonds of gossamer that were nevertheless as strong as the steel of a coiled spring. She was now a fly in the web, permitted to conduct herself as a guest spider. It was a web that would spin outward from here, and from other Genestealer lairs, so the Magus dreamed, to entrap all sentient creatures of the galaxy in its domineering, adhesive embrace. As any sensible being, honed to survival would, in a new environment, she roamed. The brats and guard ambled after her. She sauntered, stooped, hooves clicking flagstones through crypt and vault lit with aromatic oil burning in golden lamps, hung with tapestries, depicting abstractedly the deserts of Salor, its seas of sand. Here was a librarium full of tomes about worlds, worlds, worlds. What a hunger for worlds a Genestealer must feel, what a blind, frustrated hunger, until a captured species of breeders gave it the means to sate its greed. How appropriate that next to the librarium was a great kitchen and larders piled with extraterrestrial imports. Here, behind a jail-like barred door, was a treasury, banded chests abrim with shekels. Behind other bars, an armory storing different treasure, stun guns, stub guns, bolt pistols, lasers. In a birthing chamber, adjacent to a well-equipped surgery, seemingly hugely pregnant females lay in silk upon the softer-seeming feather beds, human-seeming females, bestial females, side by side. Melindy noted stone stairways leading upward, vaulted tunnels that vanished away darkly. She memorized the subterranean layout, matching it against her recollection of the temple above. Here, a long stone ramp led up to a great purple trapdoor that would rise on chains. Garaged below, a long purple limousine with toughened reflective curtained windows, its radiator grille a great grin of brass teeth, its armoured panels studied elegantly with chromium-plated rivets. The Magus's personal transport, no doubt. Could it be that the Patriarch itself ever rode unseen through the dusty streets of Shandabar, leering out at its pasture of people, its great paddock of prey? She trotted lithely back from her tour to the main family chamber. Of these tunnels and chambers below the temple were a sewer of alien evil. An evil compelled by a foul, cunning, imperative joke of nature to be none other than just that. Evil that even wore a mask of ultimate community. However, in Shandabar City was also plumbed in the sanitary sense. In a privy, Melindy had defecated her transformed supper of the previous night, and before flushing that away with a push of her claw, wondered if her excrement had been doubly metamorphosized. The food transformed not only into dung, but into identifiably Genestealer dung. Perhaps her bowels remained her own, perhaps her dirt was the talisman of her identity. If so, considering the keen senses of the Genestealers, thanks be for plumbing. In the callous part of her, she made a mental note to mention this aspect of her mission. Could an assassin, transformed into an alien, be tripped up by an all-too-human stool? The brood had stirred. The brood fed, she too, and dispersed about their duties, though the throne room was always well visited, as if kin loved to bask regularly in the presence of their patriarch. That vile eminence, which had snoozed night long in its horned throne, stirred at last. Immediately its violet eyes, roomy from slumber, sought out Melindy. It beckoned with a claw. Its hybrid guards were alert now. The Magus hastened to its side as Melindy approached, not bowing, no, straightening herself somewhat indeed. She decided by now that a frontal stoop might be misconstrued as the attack crouch. The Magus rocked gently to and fro, heeding. "We being the dreamers of bodies," he said to Melindy, "we kissing the dream of ourselves into the bodies of human beings, a dream that is enrapturing them. Our grandsire was dreaming of your body, new one." Melindy experienced a brief squirm of courtesanly disgust of the apprehension felt by a paramour when first confronting a singularly bloated and repulsive debauchee, the virgin instant before professionalism and pretense triumph. But of course a gene-stealer was quite without sexual lust as such. A gene-stealer's loins were blank save for an anal vent protected by a tough flap. She projected her semblance of love. Grandsire's dream was highlighting patterns on your body, which indeed he is perceiving faintly now that his dream has been showing those dim, distorted images of spider, snake, and beetle. The Patriarch could see the trace of her tattoos. Those should have been engulfed, submerged by the purple-red pigment of her swollen new muscles, by the deep blue of her horny carapace. Certainly they had seemed to vanish utterly when she had first transformed herself, with Tarek Ziz as audience. No human eyes had spied her eerie, but provokingly sinister tattoos, which so much spelled out herself, to be her own private heraldry. No human eyes. The mesmeric vein-webbed orbs of the granddaddy of evil saw somewhat differently. She sighed. Pistiscus, many being large poisonous arachnids and serpents, mottled skins of the human lingo mimes mimicking those, my human mother, passing such blemishes unto me, slight birthmarks. The Patriarch grunted several times, ingesting her story like a hog its swill. The Magnus glared skeptically. "A variant upon genetic inheritance of acquired characteristics," he said pryingly. "Being the gene-stealer glory, that and the later expression of our own lurking somatype. Yes, the pirating of genes, the boarding of the vessel of an alien breed's body, being is what giving us our holy name. But for a human being to be transmitting her personal acquired marks as opposed to a capacity for acquiring such. Damn his clever mind and his grubbing in that librarium." "Not understanding," hissed Melindy, and truly she didn't. It was all utterly irrelevant. From the direction of the tunnel from which she had first entered the lair of the brood bustled the hunchbacked, yellow-faced landlord of the caravanserai. He held up Melindy's discarded robe and the device that she had rigged up in her room that held her syringe of polymorphine. Around his neck he had draped her red sash. "Being treachery, bewaring," he cried. Guards raised their bolt pistols, staring around for an enemy. "Seizing that new one," spat the Magus, saliva spraying at Melindy. 4 strong hybrids leapt to pinion her by the arms. For a moment she stiffened, as if in surprise, both testing their vigor and about to fight. Then, before they could have even sensed resistance, she relaxed. She could probably throw them off. What then? Could she trigger a salvo of explosive bolts, some of which might strike the Patriarch if she leapt at it? Bolts that would destroy her in the process too? No. The brood wouldn't recklessly put their Patriarch in such peril. They would surely hold their fire at close quarters. With her claws and fangs alone, she, a hybrid, might never be able to kill a full-blown, mature Patriarch, who might loll, who might snooze, yet who was probably the most lethal fighting creature in all of the galaxy, whose claws could rip through a Space Marine's powered combat armor as if that a mere sheath of thin tin. She couldn't hope to operate a bolt gun. Her claws were too crude to work the trigger. The sash left behind in her lodgings, the improvised frame for the little hypodermic, where else could she have left those? And her robe in the tunnel, where else? Nevertheless, she felt that she had walked right into the trap of her own making, marched into it through self-hatred, or at least through hatred of what Tarek Ziz had done to her. The Patriarch crunched its claws together. The Magus almost jigged with the power of its sendings. The mesmeric, clever leader of the brood was a puppet show, its true role blatantly apparent, that of a lordly, willing slave to the gross granddaddy. For that Magus, who boasted of the glory of the Genestealers, was not a full Genestealer himself. He wasn't pure strain. He was talented, puissant, a tool of the Patriarch and of the Genestealer mission. A tool. Just as Melindy herself was an instrument. And thus it would be under the perverted, loving tyranny of the Genestealer triumphant, a cousinhood of captivated, obedient, cattle-like species, lowing their praise of their predator. It was almost as though the Genestealers had been, well, consciously devised, to enslave the different races of the galaxy, to prepare the ground, to sow the seed to which something else unimaginable might reap. Melindy thrust this speculation from her mind, as the hunchback proclaimed slyly, "A pilgrim woman come into my caravan, see, from a cavern world, saying seemingly an imperious princess in disguise. Then finding her gone, and the sash of many marvels in her room, this some enigmatic, some plain in purpose, such as a garrote, and this device for injecting some substance, discovering her robe in the tunnel I was telling her of, prankfully, as so to be presenting a fine fertile vessel to our lord, his tongue to be kissing deep, a new one being here, and where is that covert princess of the caverns, eh?" "Cousin," said the Magus, "we too are having our suspicions of the new one."
"Oh, are we?"
retorted the hunchback. "Yet, that a pilgrim woman should be becoming a mighty hybrid, being contrary to anatomy."
"Big galaxy, cousin, full of strange marvels, no doubt."
"Being well aware."
"Pedantically aware at times." "Despite charisma of glowing eyes, despite charm of handsome countenance and splendid limbs."
"So there we are having it," said the Patriarch's supreme puppet. "You yourself might be being Magus, but for your exaggerated deformity, and because of your lacking sufficient grace. So our grandsire was not countenancing you, my jealous, loving cousin. Thus you are seeking undermining me, maybe, with this story of a woman?" Was it possible, thought Melindy, that the hunchback and the Magus might quarrel bitterly enough to allow her some grace, some leeway? No, for the Patriarch arose, exerted its control of its kindred. "Bring that needle against the new one," ordered the Magus, piercing apart, testing. He mused. "Through which part? Where, new one, will you be sticking out your tongue?"
"Not stupid man planning poisoning this refugee?"
Melindy asked, as if ignorance.
"This being asylum in your tabernacle, yet willingly, trustingly I am obeying my newly adopted ward."
As she had hoped, at the hunchback's approach, two of the hybrids who had held her moved aside out of the way. The Patriarch was watching her fixedly, unblinkingly. She let herself be limp in the grip of her two remaining captors. 2. Only 2. Yes, she relaxed. However, in her spirit she was back inside the exercise wheel, racing, accelerating. Within her, a flywheel was accumulating momentum, ready to release it in one great burst, in one transcendental surge of power that would carry her right over the top. A spring was winding up, coiling tight. Yet she must be utterly lucky too. Yet luck was often a gift of grace, and who was more graceful than a Calidus assassin? She prayed to the God Emperor on earth. Never has she needed his grace more. The wheel spun wildly. The spring tightened towards the point where it must either snap or be released. Utterly lucky, if she was to succeed before she died. For surely she would die. The suicide song keened through her soul, the harmony of exemplary suicide. And yet, of course, at such a moment, an assassin, by bidding farewell to self, could survive and survive, weaving through a host of foes and weapons, killing as her cousins of the Eversaw Shrine. But she was Calidus, and Calidus had betrayed her, so something was missing from her song. Rage arose in her once more, utmost fury at her violation. She saw the Patriarch before her as a monstrous Tarek Ziz, who could blithely implant this vile form within a violated human being. Alas, she could never vent her scalding vengeance upon the Director Secundus, on account of her oaths, her loyalties. But she could aim all of that venom at the Patriarch. Now the wheel was white-hot. Now the spring was razor-edged. The hunchback held the hypodermic in its framework towards her snout. By a sudden slump, with a twisting spin, with a violent upthrust of her arms, she shucked off her captors. In her claws she seized the framework. She rotated it in a trice. Brushing the needle aside, she threw herself at the Patriarch, the little jutting needle aimed at its left eye. The Patriarch uttered a squeal, more of surprise than of a pig being impaled. What, impaled by a pinprick, even in the corner of the eye? Snarling, the Patriarch was already batting Melindy aside. She rose, ready to grip the Magus as a shield. Some lurid magenta blood flecked the Patriarch's eye. Some violent liquid seemed to leak. It reared its mighty head and roared. This stupid, insignificant injury was nothing to it. Nothing. A flea bite. Pure, raw, ravening gene-stealer now. The Patriarch reached out its claw arms. Yet it did not attack at once. Perhaps perplexed at the feebleness of assault caused it to pause. Perhaps detecting no further threat, it was turning its senses inwards, attempting to diagnose what substance had entered it. A poison? Hardly. How soon? Dear Emperor, how soon? Abruptly, the polymorphine began to work on an untrained anatomy, on a creature which had no idea of what was happening to it, and hardly enough time to guess by introspection. The Patriarch's body rippled as its carapace softened, as though a coating of worms crawled underneath its previously horny hide. Its head distorted sidelong, its injured eye solidified into a marble ball. Its teeth fused together, then, as it howled, the joint teeth softened and stretched like rubber. Its claws began to bud further teeth. Its lower simian hands became floppy pincers. It was in flux. Nothing could teach it how to hold its form intact. It vented excrement, its tongue pressed out between the elastic teeth. Longer, thinner. The monster, even more monstrous now, collapsed back across its throne, and in its one true eye, Melindy could see how fiercely, how desperately it was willing itself to keep its shape amidst the anarchy that engulfed it. Willing, yet failing, since it couldn't perceive the proper shape of its own internal organs, while those swelled or pinched or stretched. And since it was in flux, its broodkin were in confusion. Appalled by its continuing transformations, they were rocked by its incoherent sendings. The Patriarch's organs and appendages were dissolving and reforming, whilst its tormented will still endured. Suddenly, its softened thorax split open. Pulsing coils spilled out, liquefying. The exposed innards of the true master of the Orient Temple melted into protoplasmic jelly. With her own claws, Melindy crushed the arms of the Magus. She drew up a steel knee to break his spine. Throwing him back at the nearest guards, she darted to the hunchback. Seizing him under one arm, she bore him away, the sash still hanging around his neck. As she raced into the tunnel that would lead to a certain stairway, explosive bolts whined past her inaccurately, detonating against the stonework, spraying splinters. Behind her, broodkin screeched as the Patriarch's death agony communicated itself. Confusion, chaos, and then an onrush of broodkin in her wake intent on vengeance. She emerged in the hall of holy fingernails and sprinted for the great doorway through the reek of candle smoke and incense. Pilgrims scattered. She tossed a hybrid deacon aside, eviscerating him with her free claw as brutish broodkin boiled up into the hall behind her. Outside, a morning pageant was in process. She rushed through the illusionary halls of the Phantom Throne Room just as the parody Space Marines were opening fire at the Green Demon's guards. As guards and Marines died and vanished, along with the grovelling audiences of lords and ladies, for a moment the gawping audience of pilgrims and tourists must have imagined that the monster Melindy and her struggling burden were a part of the spectacle. Then the caricature Emperor entered behind her, gesturing with those extraordinary fingernails. Rushing around him, bursting right through his holographic image, snarling parodies of humanity invaded the throne room. The brood had temporarily lost all leadership. A salvo of bolts winged into the crowd, blasting bloody craters in flesh, for the spectators were in the way. Their toppling corpses nevertheless served to shield Melindy. She leapt through the phantom wall into the actual sandy courtyard and raced. Behind, she heard no more firing, only hideous screams. Nor were the broodkin following her out into the open, under the ballooning red sun. Perhaps a collective caution prevailed. Perhaps the broodkin were busy slaughtering all witnesses of their wanton exposure prior to withdrawing. Or, insensate, the brood may have decided to wreak their wrath bare-handed and sharp-clawed upon any available human victims. Certainly none escaped through the illusionary walls, which in their panic may have seemed all too real. Voices cried out around Melindy in disbelief or pious terror about a demon on the loose. Sirens of armoured police vehicles were beginning to shriek, but Melindy was expert at evasion. Darting down one side alley, then another, she found a sewer hatch and tore it open. She thrust the hunchback down inside the tilted hole to drop to the bottom of the splash, then inserted herself with legs and bony back braced, as so to slide the lid back into place above her, difficult with claws instead of fingers. In part flooded, stinking darkness, she regained hold of the hunchback. She squeezed him.
"Sir would-be Magnus," she wheezed. "I being helping you, eh? You must be waiting for new pure strain being born, to whom you shall be becoming uncle, then high servant and oracle. Who better?"
"What being you?" the hunchback managed to ask, terror and cunning warring in his voice.
"An ally. Would you be seeing a miracle?"
Yes.
"Tiny electrolumen in my sash. You lighting it?"
The hunchback groped for a long while before the tiny light brightened in the cramped tunnel which they were crouched in.
"Being needled in my sash, hold it out at me. I am becoming harmless to you then as pilgrim woman,
The hunchback nodded. He held the needle firmly. Melindy bit the tip of her tongue between her fangs, impaling the injured, softer tissue flesh beneath. Upon the sharp needle, she pressed her tongue forward to discharge the drug into herself. Soon her body was molten. Soon her implants were slackening, shrinking. The hunchback stared, goggle-eyed. She spat some blood from her mouth. Despite the stenchful surroundings, the hunchback now gazed hungrily at the nude tattooed body, amazingly revealed to him.
"Safer as a woman,"
he agreed, licking his lips.
"Softer to be questioning about this wondrous liquid that is altering bodies. With such guile we could be disguising our hybrids perfectly."
He shifted his left hand from behind his back. On one finger he wore the Chocorow needle gun. While the convulsive changes had distracted her, whilst her vision had glazed, the hunchback had filched the miniature weapon from her sash and slipped it on. Or maybe he'd already transferred the tiny gun to the pocket of his robe much earlier, recognizing it for what it was.
"Not being fooled into this being a ring, princess. My cousin being duped, perhaps, not I. Ah, how poetically you are bending his spine, making him just like me in death."
He pointed his armed finger at her.
"When I am bending my finger sharply, this gun is discharging, I am supposing?"
Yes. By and large, yes. The hunchback may well succeed in firing the gun.
"Staying here a while excitement is dying, then sneaking to my fine establishment and into a certain cellar. You ravaged my clan, which, softer to question, yes."
He was wrong. Melindy was herself again, no longer encumbered by clumsy claws and a stoop. Once again she was a Calidus assassin. If the environs were cramped, what of that? She shuffled, ever so slightly. 5 minutes later, during a moment of mild inattention when boots rang on the sewer lid overhead, the hunchback died quickly and silently, throat-punched, nerve-blocked, broken-necked, without even crooking his finger once. Melindy was ravenous after the change. She had to feed. She only knew one immediate source of protein, and the proprietor of the caravanserai had stared at her hungrily. Now she replayed the compliment, somewhat reluctantly. In her famished state, his corpse tasted sweet. She balled up his robe to haul behind her, tied to one ankle. She reasoned that she could crawl for a mile or so to escape from the immediate neighbourhood. Some pipes were to prove tight and deep and effluent. She needed to dislocate her joints and hold her breath. She did so. She was an instrument. She was Calidus. She trotted back through the city under the cold constellations, heading back towards the spaceport. Patriarch and Magus were both dead, yet the evil clan remained. Maybe the city police would react and call in heavy assistance. Maybe the local police were themselves infiltrated by hybrids. Melindy had no intention of discussing matters with anybody in Shandabar. She had infiltrated a Gene Stealer stronghold for a night and a morning and had survived. By luck. through rage, and courtesy of polymorphine, misused as no assassin had misused the drug before. Perhaps that would be a bright enough feather in Targaziz's cap. The alien beast lurked within her, as it always would, tamed, yet holding her captive. How her heart grieved.